is yet calling it the Foshan miracle. I think that's what we're here to explore. And to do so, we're joined by a very eminent panel of 4 persons. I won't go into the detail because you do have the bios in your material. But we have a group that's in many ways thought about everything from the specifics of urban planning to the broader issues of rural development and development more broadly, both from the private sector as well as the academic basis. So to my immediate left is William Bill Overholt, now with the Fung Global Institute, which, as you all know, has a deep program in the subject area. He is on leave from Harvard University. He has had a long and distinguished career in investment banking in this region, as well as in academia. So welcome, Bill. To his left is Wang Yiping, who perhaps needs no introduction to this group, a scholar from the National School of Development at Peking University, and has also straddled the private sector and the academic worlds, and so can bring both the practitioner as well as the academic experience to our discussion. To his left, Lu Mai, Secretary General of the China Development Research Foundation, an expert in rural planning, has done considerable work and thinking on China's development experience and the transitions that poor countries go through as they become richer, and the knowledge and research base that is needed to sustain and make that experience thrive. And last but not least, John MacArthur, also from the Fung Global Institute, who has worked previously at the Earth Institute at Columbia, affiliated with Brookings and the UN Foundation as well, now with Fung, and not coincidentally a great guy because he's a fellow Canadian. So welcome, John. One of the things that struck me about the discussion previously was that Foshan in some ways is a representation of a broader trend. We're told 17, but it's not the number that matters. So the broader trend of specific clusters of industries and towns that thrive, and so come to represent some kind of national model. We also heard about the 3 pillars, economic, social / political, and environmental, so that if we have a framework to think about Foshan, then it would be through the lens that these 3 pillars provide us. And the transition, in some ways, from the previous session to this one, is the question of the broader lessons that Foshan holds and the so-called middle income trap. Is Foshan the harbinger of great things to come for it, and also a wider and wider hinterland, or is it, and I'll use the analogy quite reservedly, is it like a Millennium Village, where perhaps it is very site-specific? We will use the same format as we have in other sessions, which is we'll have our panel reflect on these issues. We'll then have a discussion, and then we'll provide some time to wrap up. And we should absolutely be out of here by 6:15, but we should wrap up between 6 and 6:15 to be fair to all of us and the organizer. Bill, I'd like to ask you, if you would, to give us a rundown, if you would, on what exactly is the middle income trap and how it connects with our topic of this session.
Hello? Okay, that works. Well, first, for those who weren't at the previous session, just a few summary remarks from the Foshan experts that went before. Foshan's a fabulously successful city north of here, 7 million people, about the same population as Hong Kong. It started in '79 with a per capita income of $300. That is now $15,000, which puts it in the World Bank's high income group. It has 320,000 private enterprises, generating a little over 60% of growth. In many ways, it's not representative of China. In many ways, it's representative of the future of China, if China is successful. What is the middle income trap? It's a very misleading phrase. With a company or a city, you start out with some growth strategy. Say you're an entrepreneur and you've created a new widget, and this entrepreneur has tremendous success, and he hits a ceiling and has to professionalize the company, bureaucratize, get specialist finance people, HR people. Some companies make that transition and some don't. And it's the same with a national economy or a city economy. Sometimes you're selling resources, and you can only get to a certain level by selling resources. In Foshan's case, they've been selling exports. They for a long time sold exports based on cheap labor. Well, how do you know when you've hit one of these ceilings? In Foshan's case, they have huge debt. The debt service is 47% of government revenues. And just to put in perspective, Japan is the most indebted government on earth as a national government. Their debt service is 25% of government revenues. Foshan's is double that before land sales. So they've been covering this by seizing land and selling it. But that process is reaching both economic and political limits. So they're hitting a ceiling there. Their finances, the money mostly goes to state enterprises. But the state enterprise productivity is radically deteriorating. And so they need to find a way to get money to the really dynamic small and medium and private enterprises. But that requires big changes in the way interest rates are controlled and steps on a lot of toes. Another sign that some kind of threshold has been reached is environmental difficulties. Exports based on cheap wages don't work so well when wages are going up by double-digit levels every year, and the currency is rising too. They're having to shift from serving export markets to serving the domestic market. So when you add these all up, it is a tremendous challenge to take it to the next level. As they tackle this challenge, we heard from the previous panel, that they have a lot of very special resources. They've built better infrastructure than a lot of other cities. They've educated their people better. They've treated their migrant labor better. So as labor becomes short, the migrant labor is less likely to run away than it is in other places. a lot of advantages, but still some big problems, because as they make the reforms that they need to make, changing the banking system, changing the land, the way they use land, changing interest rates. If you're a city government looking at that huge debt, your ability to sell land is going down, and then you're being told you have to let interest rates rise. So your debt's going to become more of a problem. And the currency's going to go up, so you're going to have a lot less export income. And trying to deal with a property bubble and need new sources of income, so you're going to put a property tax on, that makes your revenue go away even faster. So in the medium term, you look at 5 years, in order to survive, you got to make all these changes. But in order to get through next year, you got to fight like crazy against these changes. That's the middle income trap, Foshan style.
Thank you. What did you want to give us also a sense of the middle income trap in Foshan, and then we'll move to the broader issues.
Middle income trap to me is most countries are able to lift their income level from very low, very poor levels to something like 5, 6, or 7,000 US dollars. And the question is, can you become a rich country or high income country? At the moment, the World Bank marks it at something like 12,000 US dollars. And if you look at the World Bank data, out of 80 countries during the last 60 years or so within that range, only 13 countries or economies made it to high income countries. So the critical test whether or not you're able to move from 6,000 US dollars per capita at the moment in China to 12,000 is really whether or not you are able to upgrade your industry. And we are losing competitiveness in low-end manufacturing at the moment. The question is, can we build high value-added and high technology sectors? The answer is, I guess, uncertain. Now, just a couple of words about the Foshan, my understanding, limited understanding of Foshan. I think in general, it's a very similar story of the story for the whole China. It's been very successful. You can see elements of very efficient market, plus proactive government in driving economic growth. That really is about it. But I think Foshan faces almost the similar challenges as the rest of the world, the rest of the country. We have been very successful in delivering strong growth, but we are facing big challenges like what Bill just mentioned. When you accumulate your debt revenue level at a level like this, how do you continue? And when you rely on the cheap labor in building your industries for a very long time, and the non-cost doubling, tripling, where are the new, more competitive industries? So I think the very similar challenges we're facing in China and in Foshan. Perhaps Foshan offers some unique features when you compare it to the large part of the country. I will only name 3 of them, then I will stop. The first is its geographic proximity to Hong Kong, which means the economy is just much more open than the rest of the country. The second, it probably has less prominent state sector in the economy. So actually you have less opposition when you're adjusting economic structure of the so-called vested interest. It makes it easier. Think about Northeast China, how do you do it? That's the first thing you have to overcome, and it's very difficult. The last thing, I think it's also useful to remember that the Pearl River Delta actually draws in lots of migrant workers. And the good thing with migrant workers not giving them the hukou system, the resident status, is you can use them, and if you don't need them, they have to go away. And so I saw from the report, the government is trying very hard to recruit these talented migrant workers. That is something Foshan probably will be able to do. But if you like a local government in inland provinces, you just you're born with lots of unskilled workers. How do you move to the next level of development? I think the challenge is much tougher than Foshan. That's my take.
And as we move to Lumai and John, I'd like to reflect on this. The renditions of middle income trap that we heard from Bill and Huang have been essentially based on economic and business considerations. In the previous panel, but also in this one, we've been asked to think about the other constraints to success, which can be social and environmental. So might you talk to us about the middle income trap and perhaps weave in those dimensions if you can?
First, I'd like to congratulations to Mr. Liu Mingtang and Mr. Xiao for their wonderful job. They tell a whole story about one city, how it grows, how they achieve this stage. So the question is, would we use this case to answer the question that China can or cannot pass that middle income trap? The lessons we got from this case is how government and the market, how government and the society interact. In the last 30 years, Foshan, or we call this Nanhai, Shunde, they do make a lot of changes. From one side, it's a problem. From another side, it's reform and progress. Very fortunately, I visited Nanhai district. It used to call the Nanhai County, and then Nanhai City, and now become the Nanhai district of Foshan 3 times. Later, 1980, middle of 1990, and in this century. So in the later of 1980, I worked in the Development Research Center, a rural development research center of City Council, in charge of rural experiment. Nanhai County did a very important reform about the land. The land they sell to the government from agriculture to non-agricultural use. Nanhai is the pilot, the county, who give farmers 10 to 30% of land for themselves, so they can use as a collective use. So Sheldon mentioned this, but originally it comes from that time, and they organized economic cooperation. So every resident in that village has a share about those use rights. But collective use this, they lend this to Hong Kong company or to some private company. That's the first step. And the second step, they have a problem. They have a collective owned enterprises. It's so successful, and some people, Xu Chenggang said that this is a miracle. But at that time, 1995, I visited there. They already faced the problem. They see the efficiency problem. They see the competition. So they privatize all those collectively owned, or in Shunde is state-owned, the county level government owned. Very successful. After 15 years, I go back, and all those companies continue to move forward. And in last 5 years, CDRF did some work for local government of Nanhai district. It's a government performance evaluation. With the Financial Bureau asked us to do this evaluation before they make the decision of how to distribute those financial resources. So very interesting to see through this process, they make it more transparent, more efficient to use this lot of money just merged from this prosperity. So they did before to make a budget decision, and now they started to do the after budget, after the financial year, to do the budget evaluation again. So we did that. These three periods, we see the different problems. First problem is the problem state with the farmers. The second stage is the collective ownership. The third stage is how government functions and how to make it more democratic. So the lessons we learn from here is Foshan or Shanghai is really dynamics. They face the challenge and they deal with those challenges and they find a solution. So it's still facing these problems. From one side, if we look China, we see a lot of challenge. But from another side, we see the reform and the progress. In Shanghai or in Foshan, the same story is happening again and again. So that I'm quite optimistic about Foshan. They have serious social problems still. I don't trust those government officials who said we did a great job for migrants. It's not they have a very high, you need to accumulate score to get a hukou. So the public service has a different way to deal with those migrants. If they need your technology, they give you full, let's say, citizenship. Or you have money, you can buy apartment, you have a full citizenship. Otherwise, you need to wait quite long to get this kind of the hukou. So they still have a long way to respond to the society, to all the people, all the residents in that area. So that's a big challenge for them. Environmental is another one. So I stop here.
Thank you. John?
Thank you. I was reflecting coming into today that I worked on, helped write the Global Competitiveness Report many years ago. And one of the things we did when we rewrote the index was talk about what does it look like to go from a skill-based economy to an endogenous growth economy and an innovation-based economy. And these themes I was prompted to remember come up so specifically in Foshan. And I would say, you asked the question, Rohington, is this like a Millennium Village? I would say in many ways it's the converse, because the Millennium Villages are saying for the places that are the most difficult, remote, disconnected in the world, is there a way to make them economically viable? Here, it's the places that are in the heart of the Pearl River Delta. These are the tip of the spear in terms of the economic strategy of the country. And the question much more is, what is the next iteration of the challenge? Because the problems of Foshan are not the same as in the Northwest Frontier or anything. They're absolutely different, as has been mentioned. And so when I look, and I've been involved, I would say at a distance, but at a healthy kind of engagement with Xiaogang and the team over the past year. And there are a few things that really stood out to me in reflecting on the report. So much of this middle income trap is one key element of shifting to an innovation-based economy. But I actually think that since I first thought about this a dozen years ago, what it means to be an innovation-based economy has changed. This gets into systems of governance. This gets into who is responsible for innovation systems. This gets into even the notion of subsidiarity and what is the interface between the business, between the society, and between the government. We've seen in the United States and many cities in Canada, for example, that whereas innovation systems were national for many generations, the national research bodies still are fundamental. The national scientific budgets are still fundamental. but the local innovation systems actually become fundamental to the economic strategy. The local innovation systems also interface with the local social systems. And so there's even a very nice full-page reflection on Mayor Bloomberg in New York in the Financial Times today, looking at how he was trying to create a so-called sixth borough in New York City to make it an attractive hub for talent, to maintain the economic innovation that's needed in that city so that it doesn't rest on the laurels of Wall Street. And the actual quality of life issues matter profoundly, even in that global capital in a far-reaching basis, in addition to building on what Roosevelt Island, a new engineering training scientific center to complement the skills that are needed even there. So I see these as very fundamental issues where Foshan helps tell us in a way that's perhaps a little bit under most people's radar what some of these fundamental challenges are around China. And some of the things that I found quite surprising were, first, the role of the land markets in the economic story. I'm not expert on it, so I don't want to overstate, but the extent to which household wealth was accumulated and kickstarted a growth story almost sounds like a Dutch disease dynamic with a shift towards the non-tradable sector in the local economy. That can be healthy as part of rebalancing towards the service sector, but it's also a tremendous challenge to navigate as time goes on. Second is this role that came up in the earlier session of the exports through, call it secondary brands around the world, competing on technology upgrading to emerging markets around the world rather than the so-called frontier brand markets. It's a very interesting and innovative strategy for technology upgrading. Third is this issue of migrant labor. I would put it quite bluntly, if 2/3 of the workforce is migrant labor, and one is aiming to pioneer municipal governance strategies, there's a fundamental principal agent question there as to how best to set up the right feedback structure so that innovation can continue over time. And then a fourth one I would add is this issue of fiscal management at the urban level. It had never occurred to me as a distant observer of these issues for many years, the extent to which cities that are making very good investments in their infrastructure might be punished by the lack of a bankruptcy procedure at the municipal level. And the way that all the interest rates are set, the way that the incentives are aligned, there's a general, if you will, punditry that says Chinese cities are investing in weak infrastructure. Foshan seems to tell a story of very strong infrastructure, and that might not get recognized enough because of the lack of a way to discern between stronger and weaker investments. And then the final point I would add is that we are now seeing in a global conversation right now a deep interface on how infrastructure links to the environment. And this ties into the governance. So a major issue, for example, is for decarbonizing economies, how to set up the incentives for long-term, multi-generational, low-carbon investment projects, which requires, for example, political risk mitigation mechanisms on a multi-generational basis. These don't currently exist internationally, so a lot of the large pools of capital don't have a way to make the investments they would like to make based on the return profile. So I do see that the innovation at the governance level is one of the more exciting but uncertain areas of how to tackle this social innovation and clean energy, environmental sustainability nexus that we're seeing as desperately needed in so many parts of the world.
Thank you all. One of the things that strikes me from what all of you said about the role of migrant labor, the interaction of various levels this is a story about cities throughout history, and while it can be simplistic to always refer to history, Foshan is not an isolated instance either, and we might want to come back to that at the end of the panel. But I thought we'd now spend some time taking questions or comments from you, and you can direct them either to someone specific on the panel or more broadly. And I know there were some leftover questions from the previous panel as well, so the floor is yours. Raise your, so.
Yes. My question is about the income gap between the people living in Foshan. Because the last session, the per capita GDP is quite high, 50,000 US dollars. But if the income gap between the residents is quite big, it might lead to the society instability of the society, which is very bad for the city and the governance and also economic development. How is the situation of the Foshan, the income gap between the people, especially the people who live there, who have that food hall, and the migrant workers or something like that? And are there some improvement project or plan for the Foshan city or not? That's my question.
I don't know what the income inequality is. Maybe Xiaogang his numbers, but one thing that came out of the report is wealth. The way things happen in China, almost everybody has a house, a home. And the economic success then inflated raised, to use a more neutral term, drastically the value of the homes. So when you're worried about social instability, almost all these local families have a stake in society. They own a home. And that home has considerable value. If I remember correctly, the average wealth is 50,000 US dollars, and the average bank account contains $20,000. I don't know what this percentage of Americans who have bank accounts of $20,000 or more, but it's pretty small. So inequality is a real problem, and maybe somebody else has the answer to that. But one of the things that never appears in Western accounts of China and the predictions of instability is this very fundamental thing that people own their own homes, the value of those homes has increased, and that gives them a big stake in stability.
Well, I don't know anything in detail about the story in Foshan, but I agree with Bill. The wealth distribution has been extremely unequal. But I do want to add a bit positive color. I think what we see in the rest of China, and I suspect it's the same in Foshan, that is migrant workers' wages have been rising faster than other people's. Because in China, if you're familiar with the labor market in China today, two things you observe. One is what we economists like to argue that China has passed the so-called Lewis turning point, which is in general we are seeing labor shortage across the country. But the second, more specifically, we see shortage of migrant workers, but the surplus of university graduates. Let's leave the second point aside for now. I think that the rapid rise in migrant workers' wage actually is extremely positive for income distribution, because you think about country as a whole, low-income household relying on wages and high-income household relying on investment returns. So when migrant workers' wage rises significantly, it actually adds more income to the low-income household, including the migrant workers. At the same time, it squeezes on the investment returns. So at the beginning of the year, the State Statistical Bureau announced, published a set of data called Gini coefficient for the last 10 years. And they actually show deterioration of income distribution until 2008, and then starts to improve. And I suspect you might be able to find a similar trend in Foshan, but that's only my guess.
Another view on this one. There's a question at the back.
I can try with mine. Yes, I wanted to ask a question. In Asia, when we talk about the middle income trap, the discussion always goes along the lines of technology, upgrading, improving the industrial structure. When people looked at Latin America, and when they asked the question, why did these countries get stuck, they looked at very differently. They looked at governance, they looked at things like the capture of the state by vested interest and things like that. So I just wanted to ask the panel, if you look at policymaking, either at the municipal level or at the higher level, do you think that is everything well, or are there things where you would worry about the incentives of policymakers? What drives policymaking? Are they captured by vested interests? And then secondly, if you do think that there are issues, what would be the kind of institutional changes that you would recommend in order to deal with those questions, in order to deal with those issues? Thanks.
For the kind of society that China is, the question you asked is extraordinarily important. I do a lot of comparative work, and you get vested interests in all societies. Political scientists call it the iron triangles. You get the regulators, the politicians, and an industry who get together and pursue the interests of that industry. In these Asian miracle economies, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, you get very powerful regulators and very powerful politicians and very powerful companies. And initially they work together because these systems only evolve when a country is scared out of its wits. It's Japan after World War II. It's South Korea after the Korean War. It's Taiwan after the Chinese Civil War. And it's China after a bad hair century, culminating in the Cultural Revolution. And during that period of fear, everybody's working together to save the country from collapse. And then success happens and the fear goes away. And you get titanium triangles. And this is the story of Japan after 1975. There were 5 sectors that captured the government: retail, agriculture, banking, construction, and property. And they blocked progress for everybody else. Japan stagnated. After 1975, wasn't the financial crisis. That was 15 years later, in 1990. It was the titanium triangles. In South Korea and Taiwan, they avoided that. They realized they had to kick their game up. Japan hit a high income trap. In Korea and Taiwan, they kicked the economy up to a new level of competitiveness, and they kicked the politics up to a new level of competitiveness, which busted up some of these titanium triangles. So they kept on growing. Japan is a failed transition. What's happening in China? They're hitting the same problem. And Zhu Rongji came close to, started to address the problem. He cut government in half. He slashing regulations, reforming the state enterprises. It looked like China was going to sail right through. But then people got tired of reform, and reform went to sleep for 10 years. And the titanium triangles have become really strong in the last 10 years. Whereas Zhurongji cut government in half, Hu and one basically doubled government party, 40 million to 70 million. Corruption increased. Now all the kids want to work for, in the year 2000, all the kids wanted to jump into the sea and work for private enterprises. Now they all want to work for the government, because that's where the money is. The virtue of China is that even in this difficult situation, they face their problems. You've had the government come out and say, we have these problems. Here's what we're going to do about it. Very clear and very explicit. And they reorganized the whole top of the government to try to smash through the resistance, which is going to be very strong. And they announced this third plenum plan. So they've got a pretty good chance. The risk is that the big weapon they have against the titanium triangles is the anti-corruption campaign. You go after the petroleum faction and bust it up so you can do some reforms. But they're not yet doing the political upgrade that is what saved Taiwan and South Korea from the titanium triangles. And this is not ideological democracy talk. This is how you manage an economy successfully. And maybe it's deferred because you can't do everything at once. Nobody can do everything at once. Or maybe they think they don't need that. We just don't know. But that's the great strength of China. You compare what they're doing with India, Brazil, South Africa, you don't see this clear definition of the problems, this clear plan, this clear restructuring for implementation. So they've got this huge strength, but just doing the economic part will not solve the problem completely.
Anyone else on this?
Thanks, Louis, for your question. One side is technical innovation. I think market can respond to this. In Foshan, we see that it's not only government, but mainly it's a market force. In one town in Shanghai, they call it Guangzhou. They used to have 13 shoe plants, produced 30 million of sports shoes export to the world. So now they only have one left, and they produce a high quality of sports shoes. Other companies change. Some of them change to the service sector, and another big company emerged from this town is the elevator. So market can respond to this. But you're right, in another sense, is institutional innovation. That's very important for the government. Government need to respond to the how do I say, ownership system and the monitoring of the market and so on. So for example, the land use right, that system changed. As I said, in the early 1990s, they have a shareholder system for collective owned land. And the farmers get the dividends every year since those collective use land they lease to the business. And after that, they keep to make changes. They register to this, and they give ownership to the women who married outside of this community. And but still, there are big problems because the leader of this community actually control how to lease this land, how to sell this land. So now come to the third primary committee. They mentioned all those collective construction land can be have an equal right with public owned. How much of this is in national? The data shows is 180,000 square kilometer is this kind of the collective constructive land. And it's 15% compared with the agricultural land. So if they use these assets, use this property, distribute very fairly, I think the farmers and those business millionaires, the gap between them, the income gap, especially from property income, will narrow. So now they discuss about how to privatize those shareholders. So you can sell this share and give to others, and you can move to the city. So I think they think those issues very seriously.
John?
Louis, you mentioned Latin America. To the extent that that's a reference point, I'm of the view that a lot of that is also misunderstood and misframed, because if you go back to the middle income trap that a lot of places have hit, the economics are often a result of a social outcome, which in many places has a very long-term history. One of the things that you see is very different, of course, social histories in the Asian countries. So if you look at the Latin American countries, there's a long-term trend where they didn't invest in science, for example. And so it wasn't that the investments were super exclusive as much as they didn't happen. And now there might be deep reasons why they didn't happen. And there were, it's like the old line about if you're stuck in traffic and the line next to you starts to move, you don't mind unless they're all of the same group and you're not of that group. Then you start to get upset. And that's a lot of what, that's a caricature of a lot of the Latin American experience, is that there's a sense that there was exclusion in terms of who didn't get to move forward. And then that probably, this is grand theories, but that probably inhibited a lot of the broad-based social investments that were needed in human capital innovation systems over time. So it's a sequencing question, but I think that there's less of those risks in many of the Asian countries, not just China, but you see that in places like Korea, the investments in the innovation system were multi-generational. So even when there's very capital intensive, in the 1970s and 80s, there was huge long-term investments in the scientific capacities of the future generations in very sophisticated ways globally. And the ability to do long-term planning in that respect, I think, is one of the things that China might have as a great advantage to look at these in the long term.
Sir.
I think it's mentioned here that what you call, when you're in middle income, the next phase of growth is going to be something linked to innovation-led growth. To what extent do we see this happening in Foshan? And probably on a general basis, can middle-income countries move up without going through an innovation-led path? Are there any examples of this? And particularly when you look at countries organized, when innovation systems are organized usually at the national level. How would this be done at the local level? I'm not sure there are any lessons in Foshan or anywhere else that would be relevant.
I feel like to respond, but I also feel like I'm in the wrong session because I really don't know enough about the Foshan. But I could make some remarks about China generally. There are lots of concerns that China has not been doing enough in innovating. And because if you talk to anybody and ask them what China has been doing well, and you heard, well, labor-intensive manufacturing. That certainly is true. But in fact, the innovation is happening all the time. And you look at the Shenzhen, for instance, Foshan, obviously, I think it's also the same. If you can move from, for instance, GDP per capita 35 years ago at around $200 US, and then now they're about 10,000 US dollars, I think you can imagine lots of innovation and upgrading happen. The same for Shenzhen, the same for the whole country. But if you could look at a number of indicators on what is happening in terms of research and development, one of the indicators globally some scholars look at is R&D expenditure as a share of GDP. That is a key indicator how much you invest in innovation. Most developing countries reach a critical mark at 1% of GDP when their GDP per capita is around 8,000 US dollars on average. China reached that mark at 3,000 US dollars. So number one, China has been investing quite a lot. Number two, in terms of innovation, so for instance, the number of patents, China simply dominates at the low end of the value chain. But that's consistent with what China's comparative advantage is. And if you look at productivity of R&D expenditure, for instance, the number of patents divided by R&D spending globally, 150 countries. 3 countries stand out, US, Japan, and China. Now, you could see most of the Chinese innovations are low end, but it's only a 6,000 US dollars country. So it actually is doing quite well in terms of making innovation. The last point, most people complain China doesn't do a good job in protecting intellectual property rights. To some extent, I'm sympathetic. I guess we do have many problems. But I also want to point out that actually China is improving in that regard as well. You look at, for instance, the Intellectual Property Rights Court set up after WTO accession. The number of cases disputed at the court is rising very significantly, and most importantly, 95% of the cases are Chinese companies suing other Chinese companies. So if you look at the global experiences, normally protection of intellectual property rights actually improve quite significantly when indigenous innovation become a mainstream phenomenon. So if you look at all these, I'm not that pessimistic actually about the innovation and the development. People always feel pessimistic when they lose competitiveness at the low end. But you look at China as a whole, you compare the inland provinces with the coastal provinces, you actually would recognize that lots of innovation is already underway.
Anyone else? So as we move into the final section of the program, and we'll go in reverse order this time, so you're on your own notice. So I'd like you to reflect on what next in the following sense. That there isn't one city in the world that has not been through its what I call Foshan phase, where you've got sort of boosters on the one hand, hand wringers on the other, several in between, and you kind of wonder where's it all headed. The second point of reference for me would be something we haven't talked about even this morning when we met, but it's early stages, but the happiness literature. And the happiness literature. And the happiness literature is finding that happiness peaks around income levels of around 10, 12,000. Beyond that, marginal utility seems to stop growing, perhaps even negative. And then the third point is when you look at some of these global surveys of cities with high quality of life and indeed connection to the rest of the country, it's not the megacities that prevail. It's sort of the Aucklands and Berlins of the world that rank highly. So keep that all in mind, plus whatever else you have as your point of reference. And end your contribution to this panel by telling us about sort of what next and what lessons does this hold for other urban planners in China or the region or beyond, and what of Foshan itself. John?
I think that a lot of this builds on the last part of the previous session, which is setting targets ultimately and goal setting. And one of the things that I think we're grappling with as a global community is how to set targets that are relevant to policy and proximate to where people live, and also globally resonant. And I've been very involved with, for example, the Global Millennium Development Goals around extreme poverty. There's a big discussion underway right now around so-called post-2015 and whether they're going to be called sustainable development goals or something else. We'll see. But much of this is around a more expansive notion of development and sustainable development and what that might look like. And there's a movement for quality of life on the happiness sentiment to be included. But I think there's also a sense of how to tackle the economic, social, and environmental pillars of development in a more systematic way. And I do believe that ultimately people in much of the world make their decisions based on what municipality they want to live in. They choose cities because that's the most psychologically resonant form of community we have in a modern society. And so I think there's something to it around setting city-based sustainable development targets, or at least agreeing that there are a variety of metrics, and maybe there are 5 that one can think about, like quality of air, quality of water, ability to get employment, ability to get a good school for your child. There's something that are what an American would call the apple pie metrics that are resonant. But with each city or subnational area having the space to set its own targets on an iterative basis. And actually, I worked with Cheng Ri of the Asian Development Bank on a related topic this year, and we said there should be something like a Zen framework for Asia, where you had the zero extreme poverty as the Z, the E is the notion of extension goals for kind of social protection, and the N is the environment. But you need something like the G20 mutual assessment process to do this, so that it's local, what the targets are, but then it's explicit with a peer review. So in effect, it's binding voluntary targets. And I actually think increasingly we need something like that for our cities, especially for our megacities, because we're at a stage in history now where the megacities are the size of what countries were not very long ago. And we need to have this principle of subsidiarity, I think, around where people live, what they measure, and what the feedback mechanisms are in a much more approximate way. And so why not start with the things that people care about and use this 2015 window to start setting, I think, quality of life goals for cities.
Thank you.
First, I would like to say about the middle-income trap and the technical innovation. I fully agree with Yiping. And if you look at this report, it mentioned in Shanghai, now they produce automobile part instead of sports shoes. So in China now we're in value chain, we move up. They produce something they call the other developed country cannot produce, but developing country cannot afford to produce because the cost is so high. So that's the position of China, and China now looks like continue to move up in this value chain. The second is about the happiness. We suffered from a lot of problems, the social and the environmental and the economic. If we look at the web, micro web, we see a lot of complaint and looks like very dangerous. But the CDRF did a well-being index. We choose not the happiness index, but the well-being index. And the result is okay. We have an objective index, but also we have a subjective survey about people. How do we satisfy or do not satisfy this way of life? In last 3 years, it's about 40% of the people, more than 40, is satisfied or very satisfied. About 40 people think about their life is okay, is 一般. And about 10% of the people is satisfied. Among them, 2% are very dissatisfied. So it's quite stable. First year is 10%. Last year is 12% because the uncertainty of a political system. And this year is come back to the 10%. If we think about 10%, it's still a huge number. It means that 130 million people do not satisfy. If we look at them, how do I say, 下岗工人, the layoff worker. If you look at the marriage, they do not marry. If you look at the age, they spread from young to the old. So it's a social problem, but it can be solved. It's already from 12% now down to the 10%. I hope in the next 7 years, it's down to 5% of people do not satisfy their life. So that's something I think this new leader can lead us to achieve.
So before we move on, Chowking, you wanted to comment on something?
Just to comment on the, I think the number of topics we touched is actually related to what we call the systemic approach. For example, mentioned about the huge gaps between the locals and the migrant workers. It is a serious problem, and what we heard from a lot of people is that Foshan could do better, because given the income and how rich the locals are, they could do better for the migrant workers. But the question is, if they do better because of the mobility of the migrants, and they will attract a lot more coming, and the physical problem, how you finance that, it also becomes an issue. And what I'm trying to point out is that for the migrants, they come to Foshan, they actually increase their human capital. Because they are working there, they get trained, they actually get paid better over time, and also they still have a piece of land at their village, so that's why there are also cases where the migrants, they actually don't want to give up their land and then actually settle in Foshan. They are looking around across the country to look at opportunities. So it's like our sense is that when we're doing research, it's actually there's a balance, there's an equilibrium, and that equilibrium depends on both local practice, but also central government policy. The policy towards the land, the policy towards the property, the policy
about the social security, all have influences, on not just Foshan, but how the Chinese migrant workers, they move. And the good thing is that the mobility is already a reality, given the high-speed rail, all the infrastructures. The Chinese are on the move. And that's actually, in retrospective, we think is the most important policy, in terms of poverty alleviation and economic development. The Chinese are literally, they can go anywhere to find a job, although they may not be entitled to the local social welfare. But the fact that they can move and find a job anywhere in China, in retrospect, we think is the most important policy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, let's take a broad perspective again. What I like to say is that I really think the decision made at the third plenum really is a policy document about how China can overcome the middle income trap. Although it's not described in that way, but I think it's about sustainability of Chinese growth. In my own sense, you look at China, you find basically, if you look at the experiences of last 30 years, you find two things standing out. The number one is it has a very unique growth model. On the one hand, the growth has been extremely successful, 10% a year for more than 30 years. That's why people call it a miracle. On the other hand, you create lots of imbalance, inefficiency, inequality problems. Our former premier said the growth model is unsustainable. And so combine these two, you need to find a solution, to find a more sustainable growth model for China. That's the first question. The second question you also recognize is China adopted a gradualism approach during its reform period, meaning basically about overcoming the dual track reform approach. We're trying to protect or maintain the interest of the state sector and the planning system, but let the activities outside the planning and the state sector grow rapidly, which has been very successful, as we can all see. But we also, over time, because we didn't really destroy all the system, the sectors, you actually build a very large part of the so-called vested interest group, and to some extent, they became stronger. And also because of the proactive roles played by the government during the reform period, the government in some areas became very powerful, and their impact on economic growth probably shifted from positive contribution to negative contribution. And financial repression is just one example. I don't want to get into detail. So you look at the policy document announced at the third plenum. My own take is three things, and they really are about how to make the Chinese growth sustainable. Number one is the top-down approach. Top-down approach is important because, well, we used to call the Chinese reform as crossing the river by touching the stones, but now the stones all disappeared. So you can use the bottom-up approach when you're liberalizing the farming system, for instance. The farmers experiment themselves, and it's good. Then the government say, well, we will adopt it. That's the time when I worked under Mr. Looming in the 1980s. But these things are no longer possible. For instance, now you don't want to look at the interest rate liberalization and the capital account convertibility. You could no longer touch the stones, and that's why top design is very important. The second reason why top-down approach becomes necessary is because you needed to really overcome the vast interest group. So in the past, we had lots of good blueprint for reforms. Most of them didn't end up with good result because you didn't really have enough strong decisiveness from the top, and that's why most of the plans didn't end up with good result. That's why I think the top-down approach is very important now. The second approach, the second element is really marketization. Basically, the government said now we need to make the market mechanism a decisive role in the system. At the beginning, I didn't really understand what it means, but later, if you read the document more carefully, basically what it says is if the market can determine, the government should not be messing around. And I think that's a very important decision. If they really implement, then the next 7 years will be the last leg of China's transition from the central planning system to a market system. The last element I think is also important is justice and fairness actually overrules efficiency. This is my personal reading, it's not said officially. All the policy documents in the past focus on development. But at this time, they focus a lot more on equity, on fairness, on justice. I think these three elements are really the cornerstones of the new policy framework for delivering a more sustainable growth in China and hopefully will overcome the middle income trap. The only qualification that many economists and scholars discussing is that while this is a very good blueprint, the question is who is going to monitor the implementation of the document. That now is more at the hand of the senior leaders, but we'll just watch.
And indeed, traditionally in economics, efficiency discussions have gone hand in hand with justice and fairness, and the divorce has been unfortunate and perhaps more recent. Bill, before we come to you, Lou, I want you to come in on one thought, and then we're back to you for the last one.
I want to respond to Sheldon's comment. The migrants, the logic is like this. If you provide a better education service, the more migrants will come. So it's a big burden for the local. Usually, not only Foshan, like Beijing, Shanghai, they say like this. So we leave, we call this left behind the children. Totally is 50 million. And we have migrant children who did not get a good service. So it's a shame, actually. With $13,000 per capita, including those migrants. You calculate by this, but you do not provide a service equally to them. Actually, by our opinion, that this is also central government's responsibility. Also, they need to give us some fiscal transfer due to the how many children live in this area. So give some incentive to local government. But if we look at the Foshan, I don't know Foshan, but Nanhai, they only spend 2% of the GDP for education. Nationwide is 4% of GDP. In Shenzhen, it's even lower if we compare with this kind of the levels of GDP per capita. It's developing country, high income country. If we compare with them, this 1% or 2% is too low. So they must increase their expenditure in education. That's their responsibility. So sorry, I do not agree with you.
Very good, thank you. Bill, last few thoughts to you.
Yeah, let me address, because how will we know how it's going for China? There's going to be a heck of a fight on all levels. And I described this Foshan that's in the document with this huge debt. It's probably one of the best in China. And so you have these local governments with incredible debts. And here comes the national government saying, okay, we're going to raise your interest rates, we're going to raise the currency so you'll have fewer exports, we're going to let you sell less land, we're going to tax properties, and we're going to make you provide social services to all these migrants. Some of these governments are going to fight back like this, it's life or death, partly because it is. Now, in this situation, if the central government did all these things all at once, it would just flatten the country financially. So if the reforms are working very well, what you're going to read in the Wall Street Journal is, oh, it's so slow. We don't know whether the government is really serious. You need a much more subtle approach. If it's going perfectly, the Wall Street Journal will be telling you that it's very slow. Ultimately, the indicator that it's going well is you'll start seeing in different parts of the country that the graduates of the best schools, like Beida, Tsinghua, Fudan, they start wanting to jump back into the sea and work for small and medium and private and foreign enterprises rather than everybody wanting to work for the government. That will be the best indicator.
So it's good for Wall Street. It's not. Well, thank you. 2 or 3 thoughts. One, housekeeping. The organizers have asked me, as a public good, I guess, to remind us all to fill out the evaluation form for this session and others, so please do that before you leave. Thank you all, because one of the senses I now have is that Foshan is both a microcosm for other cities and indeed the country as a whole, but also how special it might be in some ways. And that's also a good thing, because you need that irritation of specialness to posit other innovations. Thank you all for your questions and your participation. And do we have any what's next announcements, or do we just let everyone go? Good, you're free.